Rio and bingo, what's the name?
And you weigh the right things on the right side and the wrong things on the wrong side.
Cosine equals 87 divided by 105, the square root of 105.
I mean, I can't always be their little girl.
A child new to the world survives an ordeal most adults would fail.
Infants have extraordinary capacities not only to deal with an enriched environment, as they do in early learning, they also have a capacity to deal with a deprived environment.
I believe that the newborn has a tremendous flexibility built into it. For instance, even though the baby is born with a certain set of behaviors, there is much more to come.
One of the things that we've learned over the last 25 or 30 years is that infants are born with all kinds of abilities and all kinds of characteristics. The infant is pre-adapted to respond to the environment.
The human infant is no longer thought of as a blank slate on which every experience must be written. As helpless as an infant is, a child arrives in this world powerfully adapted for survival, growth, and learning.
Good morning.
Sleep. It's what babies seem to do most and best. Yet a closer look shows that sleep is not one thing, but many.
There are a number of different sleep states. One is quiet sleep state, a very organized control, where the baby is very quiet, you don't see movement. Then there's active sleep, which is called in the adult REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. You can really see it in babies because babies spend so much time in rapid eye movement sleep. Besides that, there's transitional sleep, and that's a period where the baby is actually moving from one of these sleep states to another.
One study has shown that efficient regulation of these sleep and awake states influences early learning.
The longitudinal study carried out at UCLA by Arthur Parmalee and other investigators and myself showed that there were relationships between the kinds of sleep characteristics the babies showed and later development.
The researchers studied a control group of premature babies from birth to age 12. Sleep patterns were observed, and later assessments of intellectual, social, and personal competence were made.
Those babies who showed more quiet sleep did tend to be more competent later in life. Infants who showed a great deal of indeterminate sleep, sleep that could not be classified, were less competent, and they were less competent at every age in which we measure them, up to age 12. The infants who showed more active sleep were better able to organize their attention, and this was particularly true at both ages 8 and 12.
3/4 was plowed, and half of the 3/4 we planted.
If you can regulate your sleep patterns and your awake patterns more effectively, you're going to be able to learn better in certain ways.
We multiply the numerators and the denominators, and we get 3/8.
Okay.
You learn better when you're alert. I mean, if you have a sleepless night, you're going to do less well the next day. It's the same thing for the baby.
We're going to do something really interesting.
We do these studies in order, first of all, to learn about children and how they develop. Secondly, we do them because we want to be able to identify those children who are having difficulties in infancy and may have difficulties later on. By having ways of assessing infants early on, we may be able to locate those children who are having problems so that we can begin intervention earlier before more difficulties develop.
Developmental researchers have long been striving to determine what skills we are born with and what we must learn for ourselves. Past vision studies, for example, have demonstrated that children are pre-adapted to use their senses to survive and develop. In a classic experiment called the visual cliff, researchers discovered that depth perception is usually present by the time the infant becomes a competent crawler. A child was placed on a table with a patterned surface, then coaxed onto a glass surface with the same pattern underneath.
Hello. Hello, kitten. Oh, Aaron. Aaron. Oh, that's Aaron.
Or maybe this will help.
The infant was extremely reluctant to crawl over the apparent cliff, even with the mother's constant urging. In another early vision experiment, researchers found that infants are pre-adapted to seek out stimulus and change. Infants were given control of a visual image through sucking a pacifier. They quickly learned to control the image and clearly demonstrated motivated exploratory behavior so necessary for survival. In a different vision experiment, researchers used a special chamber to show images to infants and observe their responses. Newborns were found to prefer larger patterns with more details and curved over straight contours, suggesting that babies are pre-adapted to look toward the curves and details of a mother's face. These early experiments and others also point to the critical function our senses play in normal development. Newborns arrive in the world ready to see, hear, touch, taste, and smell, ready to learn about people and things. The senses are conduits to the infant's brain, which assign meaning to this raw information. Only recently has technology advanced enough to provide a glimpse into the complex processes of the human brain. Positron emission tomography, or PET scanning, is one such technology that is now providing new data for scientists to evaluate and to learn from.
When PET scanning first became available to me here at UCLA, there had been some work on adults prior to my arrival at UCLA. But when I came, I was very interested in looking at children. And because this was such a novel tool that had not been used in children before, what we found was the pattern of glucose utilization in the newborn brain looked very different from that of the adult. It appeared that only the more primitive areas of the brain seemed to be working functionally in the newborn brain. This overall pattern of glucose utilization is very much in keeping with the behavior of the normal newborn. Beginning at about 2 months and going on till about 4 months of life, there is now a greater degree of cortical participation.
The infant brain begins the long developmental process of building on what was before. New areas of the brain become more active.
The areas that display white and red have in fact the highest glucose metabolic rates. Those are the areas that seem to be most functionally active and are using most glucose. On the other hand, areas that are blue and purple are using much less glucose. We know that a newborn is not able to visually track a target and reach out and grab the target, whereas the 2 to 3 month old is able to perform this task much easier. The 2 to 4 month old infant can visually track much better and reach out and grab a rattle, for instance, whereas a newborn cannot do that. In order to perform this function, the 2 to 4 month old needs certain tracking centers in the brain, which we know to be located in the parietal cortex. The infant needs to have a certain amount of motor coordination, and these are served by basal ganglia as well as the cerebellar hemispheres. So there is a good correlation between the emergence of certain behaviors of the infant and the areas of the brain that are now becoming more functionally active. At about 7 months, we begin to see an interesting phenomenon. We begin to see first the lateral portions of the frontal cortex and then the medial portion of the frontal cortex increasing its glucose metabolic activity. This is very interesting in that neuropsychologists who are familiar with infant behavior and development talk about the 6 to 8 month old period as one of cognitive development or cognitive maturation. Others talk of it as the hypothesis forming age. The clinician and in fact parents will realize and note that the 7 to 8 month old infant will demonstrate certain behaviors with respect to the presence of strangers. For instance, a 7 month old or an 8 month old in the presence of a stranger will begin to get very anxious and will cry, whereas a 5 to 6 month old will not do that, and certainly a newborn will not do that.
What's the matter, baby?
This tells us that there is a certain amount of higher cognitive processing that is going on in the brain of the 7 to 8 month old, which we believe to be mediated by frontal lobe. So this agrees well with the metabolic maturation of frontal lobe occurring at this precise same period.
The biological tools a child uses to inform the mind, such as the ears and eyes, directly affect normal development. Because there is often a sensitive period in which certain abilities develop, researchers are finding that early detection of sensory problems and prompt intervention can be critical.
If we wait until the baby's 1.5 to 2 years old, we've lost 2 good years of time in which they could have been developing speech and language. That's one of the reasons why we aim now at identifying any hearing problems much earlier. We'd like to identify a hearing problem, have a baby fit with a hearing aid if necessary by the time they're 3 or 4 months old. As long as you're happy, darling, you can do this.
Because the newborn uses his senses to learn about the world, ensuring proper hearing is important. In the past, this was a problem because infants could not respond to a hearing test.
How do you want me to turn?
Just on her side is fine.
Today, technological advances have made early identification and treatment of problems possible.
We put electrodes on the scalp, and those electrodes can sense the voltage of the response as it travels and stops at different way stations in the brainstem. We use an averaging computer and send clicks to the child's ear, clicks or tones, and as the ear senses those clicks or tones, it sends these neural impulses. The auditory brainstem response is a way of measuring the neural impulse as it travels through the brainstem, which is where reflex action happens, and all the information that we get from hearing is picked off as it travels up to the brain. The wavy lines are the actual brainstem response. Each time we see a peak in this response, it means there's been a change in the polarity in the brainstem. Usually this means that we're going through some major synapse in the brainstem.
By exposing the infant to ever softer sounds, the researcher is able to determine the threshold of hearing. If there is a problem, action can be taken, such as fitting the baby with a hearing aid, to help ensure that normal development stays on course.
It's very rare, almost impossible for a child to have a significant hearing impairment and a normal auditory brainstem response. It happens only in the very rare case. And so it's turned out to be a very reliable method for screening hearing in the newborn nursery.
Our eyes provide another avenue by which the brain gathers information about the world. And, like hearing, normal vision and normal brain development are inextricably linked.
Our eye movements have to be very, very accurate. There's 6 muscles around each eye to keep them positioned exactly where we want to look. A baby may look like he doesn't see very well because he doesn't focus in on you as well as an older person, especially a newborn, may take 2 or 3 times as long to shift his eyes from one place to another, and then he may overshoot and not look right at it and have to sort of correct. In the first month of life, they can see you. You may be foggy and the details, they couldn't see fine print, for example, but they could see a good-sized letter if you held it up in front of them. We know this because of tests like the VEP. We know that information is reaching their brain.
The Visual Evoked Potential Test, or VEP, records the brain waves of an infant, separates the visual signal, and averages the results.
Okay, you ready to watch? Here it is. This screen operates with an interrupt switch so that when she's not looking, we're not measuring because we only want visual signals here today. With a middle-sized pattern, Julie is very interested and she's watching. We're recording mainly from the back of her head, and we're seeing on one side of the display there the brainwave just raw. And on the other side, we're adding up the VEP, or the visual evoked potential. And we can see a peak developing in that signal. When we total up all the information that we have, we generate this peak and then trough of her visually evoked potential. This is a typical signal that you would get from a 5-month-old baby looking at a middle-sized, medium-sized checkerboard pattern. I like to describe a newborn's world as looking like you're in dense fog because the eyes themselves are underdeveloped, the visual pathway from the optic nerves to the brain is underdeveloped, and the brain is also underdeveloped. Newborns can see lights, they can see large objects at close range if they're bright, but everything seems duller and somewhat blurrier than it does to a mature visual system.
How sharply an infant sees the world and how well the eyes work together also affects infant perception of reality.
Acuity is a measure of how well the eye sees, whether the image is in focus or whether it's blurred. We can measure monocular acuity with a number of different techniques, including the visual evoked potential or a preferential looking technique.
Hey, baby, peekaboo. Peekaboo. Where's the baby? Peekaboo. Peekaboo.
With the preferential looking technique, we hold up a series of cards and present the cards to the infant. Each card has a gray pattern on one side and a vertical black and white stripe pattern on the other side. The infant will show a preference for the stripe pattern if they can see it. So in the test, we start out with cards with large stripes, and if the infant sees it, we move to the next smallest size until the infant shows no preference for one side or the other, meaning that both sides look gray to the infant. And that level is the infant's visual acuity. In processing visual information binocularly, we don't have to learn, or we don't have to teach our eyes to function together. It's a process that develops with visual experience, generally within the first 6 months of life. The images from the two eyes are processed together, so that instead of having two single views of the world, we perceive only having one view of the world. But by having information coming from the two eyes, as opposed to saying, why don't we just have one eye, will allow us to process the visual space in depth. Depth perception depends on binocular cues, but it also depends on monocular cues. The information that we get from the two eyes is processed together in the brain, and we see one view of the world. But we also have other cues that we use by which we judge depth. Images that are farther away appear smaller. Images that are closer to us are in front of images that are farther behind. Monocular acuity is necessary because we need a balanced input between the two eyes. If one eye is out of focus compared to the other eye, we will not develop normal binocular function.
If the eyes are otherwise normal and healthy, we will spontaneously take the two images and merge them. It's an innate ability that we have as humans of taking the two images and fusing them. However, if there is true pathology or something wrong, like strabismus with the eyes crossing, or maybe a cataract, a blurred image in one eye, this will prevent the merging process or the fusion. And during the first few months of life, the child is rapidly developing and integrating all the visual input inside the brain in the occipital cortex. It's absolutely critical that appropriate stimuli from the eyes enters the brain. If the brain is bombarded with abnormal stimuli, it'll develop abnormally. Strabismus or crossed eyes will induce abnormal brain development. We operate very early on children, even 6 months, 4 months of age for strabismus. Years ago, we used to operate when they're 4 or 5 years of age. Now we find that if we operate late, we can straighten the eyes cosmetically, but the children are not using the eyes together.
Using all their senses, newborns enter the world pre-adapted to respond to their environment. It's possible that even the infant's sense of smell may enhance survival. Psychobiological research in animal learning has helped show that a human newborn can remember and respond to odors from the first day of life.
The olfactory sense is unique in terms of cognition because it is a very primitive sense, and as a primitive sense, it has very direct access to primitive kinds of cortex. What this allows us to do is to have very rapid and certain localization of the neural changes that occur in the olfactory system. This is much different, for example, from the visual system. Moreover, the same kinds of learning occur in the olfactory system of, for example, rats, as occur in humans. That is not the case in most other kinds of human learning. Therefore, the kinds of neurobiology that we can do on olfactory cognition in rats can, we think, have direct implications for human cognition.
During the sensitive first week of life, infant rats can be trained to prefer an odor by pairing it with tactile stimulation. This experience causes a change in the metabolism of specific regions of the olfactory bulb within the brain.
What is particularly interesting is that early learning is actually changing the microcircuitry of the brain. We see an increased number of cells in just that area of the olfactory system that's processing the learned odor. What this could mean is that we are increasing the number of cells by generating more neurons, for example, or we may be saving these cells from an early death. There's a massive die-off in the brain. Early learning may prevent this kind of death. It also is possible that we're causing cells to migrate into this system.
Research established that the actual brain cell structure changed in rats that had been exposed to odors and stimulation. Corresponding signals from that part of the brain also changed.
There is a very clear relationship between the kind of early learning and the way that the brain functions from that point on. This is a long-term change in the way the brain works. We know that human infants come to prefer the odor of their mother, just as rat pups come to prefer the odor of their mother. And we wondered whether the same neural mechanisms that we were studying in rats might have a homologue or an analog in what humans are doing. And so we went to look at the humans with that in mind, using the same paradigm, the same kind of learning situation that we've been using with the rats, and they had the same kind of learning. There's no doubt that olfaction is one of a constellation of sensory interactions that the infant has with its mother. It may be one important one. Clearly, there are others that play a large role in the development of the interaction between the mother and the child.
The human infant is extraordinarily pre-adapted to survive, learn, and grow in the world, more so than was even dimly imagined just a few short years ago. New research, new technologies, new examinations into the newborn's biological gifts reveal the critical interaction of the brain and the senses in the infant's first adaptations.